The night rain lashed against the window, each droplet sliding down the glass like scratches on a gloomy painting. Eleanor stood motionless in front of the mirror, her eyes fixed on her reflection. Under the dim light of the bedside lamp, the exhaustion etched deeply on her face was unmissable. The silk nightgown clung to her slender figure, its elegance unable to mask the loneliness that consumed her. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy and deliberate, shattering the oppressive silence in the room. Eleanor turned her head, her heartbeat quickening unnaturally. Theo. Her husband Stepson emerged from the shadows, his tall frame and rain-soaked dark hair giving him an almost spectral presence. His gaze bore into her, cold, enigmatic, but there was something about those eyes that held her captive. Eleanor. Theo's voice was low and hoarse, as if he had just walked out of a storm but managed to maintain an unsettling calm. I need to talk to you. Eleanor fought to maintain her composure, though her throat felt parched. This late? Is something wrong? Theo stepped closer, the lamp's light falling on his face, accentuating the sharp, almost severe lines of his features. I couldn't sleep, he said, his eyes sweeping over her before locking onto hers. Maybe I've been thinking too much. The room seemed to shrink, its air thickening with unspoken tension. Eleanor instinctively stepped back, but her retreat was halted by the edge of the table pressing against her legs. About what? She asked, her voice carefully even. Theo didn't answer immediately. The silence he created was not empty, it felt like an undercurrent dragging everything in its wake. He stared at her, his gaze piercing through the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. Her hands trembled, and she quickly clenched them, attempting to hide her unease. Have you ever thought, Theo finally spoke, his voice slow and laden with a quiet intensity, that sometimes people can't control how they feel, even when they know it's wrong? Eleanor froze. His words struck her like a blade, cutting through the layers of denial she had so desperately clung to. She drew in a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but his unwavering eyes pinned her down, demanding an answer. Theo, she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. What are you talking about? A bolt of lightning tore through the sky, illuminating the room for a brief moment, casting stark shadows on their faces. In that fleeting light, Eleanor saw the truth she had been avoiding. No matter how much she denied it, the tension between them could no longer be ignored. And then Theo spoke, his voice steady and low but charged with a certainty that left no room for ambiguity. You know exactly what I'm talking about, Eleanor. Time seemed to halt within the room. The only sound was the relentless patter of rain, like the quickened beat of her heart. Theo's gaze bore into her, as though peering into the depths of her soul, into feelings she had refused to acknowledge but could no longer pretend didn't exist. In that moment, the rain outside wasn't the only storm threatening to engulf them. Eleanor took a step back, her eyes locked on Theo's. The tension in the room was suffocating, as heavy as the air before a violent storm. She didn't respond to his words, nor did she try to deny them. Instead, she turned away, walking toward the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside as if the rhythmic sound of rain could somehow bring her the peace she so desperately needed. But even the rain's soothing patter couldn't wash away the unease that had taken root deep within her. You shouldn't say those things, Theo. Her voice was soft but firm, carrying an unspoken plea to end the conversation right there. Theo didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, his tall frame casting a commanding shadow against the wall behind him. I can't not say it, he replied, his voice gravelly, tinged with a pain that caught her off guard. Do. You know what's been the hardest thing for me these past days, Eleanor? It's this feeling. This feeling of being pulled into something I shouldn't feel. And the more I try to avoid it, the harder it becomes to stop. A cold shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. She knew she shouldn't ask, shouldn't dig deeper into the very thing they were both trying to ignore. But his words stirred memories she had buried, memories that now clawed their way to the surface. She remembered the first time she met him, during dinner at Nathan's house. Theo had been a reserved young man, speaking only a few polite words to her, his tone clipped and his demeanor distant. His gaze, every time it landed on her, carried a silent suspicion, as though scrutinizing the woman his father had chosen. When she moved into Nathan's home, the distance between her and Theo was greater than the towering walls surrounding the estate. He made no effort to hide his coldness, sometimes bordering on disdain. She could still recall the countless mornings she tried to engage him in conversation over breakfast, or offer help with his work, only to be met with blank stares and curt responses like, "No need." But things began to shift one bitterly cold winter night. She had found Theo sitting alone on the porch, his eyes lost in the vast emptiness beyond, a half-empty bottle of wine resting beside him. Worried, she had stepped outside with a thick coat in hand. "You'll catch a cold if you stay out here like this," she had said gently, her tone firm enough that he couldn't refuse. Theo had looked up at her then, and for the first time, his gaze wasn't cold. Instead, she saw exhaustion, the kind of weariness no young man his age should bear. "I couldn't sleep," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's too much in my head." That was the first time they spoke for more than a fleeting moment. Theo had opened up, sharing stories about his mother, the woman he loved more than anyone in the world, who had left this life far too soon for him to truly comprehend what death meant. He spoke of growing up with his father, who, despite being physically present, often felt more like a ghost, always there, yet never truly there. Eleanor had listened quietly, not interrupting, not judging. For the first time, she felt as though they truly understood one another. From that night onward, their relationship began to change. The icy indifference melted, replaced by conversations that lingered longer than they should have. Sometimes they spoke of trivial things, small details about their day. But there was an unspoken understanding beneath it all. Still, there was one thing Eleanor could not ignore. The way Theo's eyes lingered on her, and the way it felt nothing like the gaze a stepson should have for his stepmother. "You don't have to say anything." Theo's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "I know this is wrong. But you know, as much as I do, that we can't keep pretending." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes meeting his. In that instant, she felt every wall she had built crumble to dust. She couldn't deny it any longer. Deep down, somewhere she didn't want to admit, she felt it too. But letting these feelings go any further would only lead to disaster. "No, Theo," she said, her voice trembling. "We have to stop this before it's too late." But as she looked into his eyes, Eleanor realized that they had crossed that line long ago. The thunder roared, splitting the air like a blade through silence. Just as quickly, the lights in the estate flickered out, plunging the entire house into darkness. Eleanor froze mid-step, her pulse quickening as the sound of the torrential rain outside grew louder, blending with the howling wind that rattled the windows. The house felt alive with the storm, every creak and gust amplifying the weight of the night. "Theo!" Eleanor called out, her voice trembling as her eyes darted around the black void of the room. "What's going on?" There was no response. She strained her ears, hearing nothing but the relentless pounding of the rain. Her chest tightened, a cold draft brushing against her skin from the slightly ajar window. It sent a chill through her, not just from the wind, but from an uneasy sense that she wasn't alone. Then, a hand gently touched her shoulder. Eleanor gasped, her body jolting in shock as she turned sharply, nearly crying out. But when her eyes adjusted to the faint light coming from outside, she saw Theo standing mere inches behind her. He had approached so quietly that she hadn't noticed until his hand met her skin. Now, he was so close that she could feel his breath grazing her neck. "It's just a power outage," Theo murmured, his deep voice cutting through the oppressive silence. It was steady, almost soothing, but the warmth in his tone sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. "There's no need to worry." "You startled me," Eleanor replied, trying to steady her breathing, though her voice betrayed the rapid thrum of her heart. "Don't do that." Theo didn't move. He remained rooted in place, his presence palpable in the confined space between them. "What are you afraid of?" he asked, his tone carrying a curious weight. "The dark. Or something else?" His words hit her like a sharp note, forcing her to look away. She had no answer, at least not one she was ready to admit. What was she afraid of? Was it the storm raging outside, or the storm raging within her? She couldn't bring herself to face him again, knowing that if she did, the thin thread of control she clung to might snap. "You should check the circuit breaker," she said, her voice strained and brittle as she turned toward the table, desperate to create distance. Her trembling fingers reached for her phone to find some light. "There's no rush," Theo replied, his voice low and deliberate, carrying an undertone she couldn't quite decipher. "This house has withstood worse storms." Eleanor didn't respond. She took a step toward the table, but in her distraction, her foot caught the edge of the rug. She gasped as she stumbled backward, the world tilting around her. Before she could hit the ground, she felt Theo's arms catch her, his hands firm yet careful as they steadied her. For a few seconds, neither of them moved. Her body was pressed against his hands resting at her waist as he held her upright. The warmth of his touch seeped through the thin fabric of her silk nightgown, sending waves of heat that mingled with the chill of the air. Her heart pounded against her ribs, every beat echoing in her ears as she became acutely aware of the closeness between them. "Careful," Theo whispered, his breath brushing against her ear. "You could hurt yourself." Eleanor wanted to push him away, to step back and re-establish the boundary they had both already blurred. But her body betrayed her, remaining frozen in place as she tilted her head up to meet his gaze. The room was dark, but even in the shadows his eyes seemed to burn with an intensity that made her chest tighten. "Theo," she began, her voice breaking into the silence, but the words caught in her throat as he leaned in. "Don't say anything," he murmured, his tone soft but resolute, almost pleading. Just for a moment. No words, no rules." She didn't know what stopped her from resisting. Maybe it was the darkness enveloping them, making the world outside feel distant and irrelevant. Maybe it was the months of isolation and loneliness gnawing at her. Or maybe it was the truth she hadn't wanted to face. That somewhere deep within, she craved this moment just as much as he did. When his lips brushed hers, it wasn't forceful or demanding, it was tentative, searching, as though he was giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. Her breath hitched as she gave in, letting herself fall into the kiss. The world around them faded, the rules, the guilt, the consequences. All that remained was the storm between them. Consuming and inescapable. When the kiss ended, the room was still again, save for the sound of their labored breaths mingling in the quiet. Eleanor took a shaky step back, her fingertips brushing against her lips, which still tingled from the lingering warmth of his. "We shouldn't," she started, but her voice faltered, her words hanging in the air unfinished. Theo didn't reply. He simply stood there, his gaze heavy with emotions she couldn't name but felt deep in her chest. And in that moment, as the rain continued to hammer against the windows and the darkness wrapped around them, Eleanor knew that they had crossed a line. There was no going back, no erasing what had just happened. Even as she stepped away, her back pressing against the cold wall, she realized that it wasn't just the power outage plunging her world into darkness, it was the choices she'd made, the feelings she'd allowed to take root. And now, everything was about to change. The next morning, the mansion was bathed in brilliant sunlight, but its golden rays did nothing to lift the weight pressing on Eleanor's chest. She sat quietly at the dining table, her eyes fixed on the steaming cup of coffee in front of her. The heat rising from the mug seemed to blend with the chaotic thoughts swirling in her mind. The darkness of the previous night still clung to her, not only because of the storm but also because of what had happened, and the truth she could no longer deny. Theo entered the kitchen, the morning light spilling across his face. Eleanor didn't look up, but she felt his gaze settle on her, as though he were waiting for her to say something. The air between them was thick, suffocating, like a fog too dense to dissipate. He didn't speak, and neither did she. They both knew that words now would only make everything worse. "You don't have to avoid me," Theo said finally, his tone calm to the point of being unsettling. "We both know what's happening." Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes flaring with anger. "You think I can just pretend everything is fine, Theo? You think this can simply be forgotten?" He let out a short, bitter laugh, devoid of any humor. "No, I don't. But I think you know as well as I do that it happened, and there's no going back." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of an approaching car broke through the tense silence. She froze, her heart nearly stopping at the familiar hum of the engine. Nathan was home. Eleanor bolted upright from her chair, panic flooding her senses. Nathan hadn't mentioned coming back early, and now she felt utterly unprepared to face him. She turned to Theo, who remained standing calmly, his expression unshaken, as though he were braced for whatever might come next. The front door swung open, and Nathan stepped inside, his face beaming with the satisfaction of a successful trip. "Eleanor, my love," he called out warmly, his voice carrying the cheer of someone oblivious to the storm brewing within his home. But as his eyes shifted to Theo, his smile faltered, a flicker of something uneasy crossing his face, as though he sensed that something wasn't right. Eleanor moved toward him, desperately trying to mask her rising dread. "You're home earlier than expected," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I wanted to surprise you," Nathan replied, though his eyes remained fixed on Theo. "Is everything all right here?" Before Eleanor could form an answer, Sarah, her closest friend, stepped in behind Nathan, her heels clicking softly against the door. She entered the room with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor felt the ground beneath her feet start to crumble. Sarah knew something. That much was clear in her gaze. "Good morning," Sarah said, her voice light but tinged with unease, as if she were trying to mask her discomfort. "Eleanor, I think we need to have a talk." "About what?" Nathan asked, his eyes shifting from Sarah to Eleanor, then to Theo. Suspicion flickered in his expression, and the room seemed to grow colder. Sarah hesitated, the seconds dragging out as though she were weighing the consequences of speaking the truth. But before she could utter a word, Nathan's voice broke the silence, low and commanding. "What's going on here?" Eleanor tried to speak, her lips parting, but no sound came out. Her breath quickened, her heart pounding so violently it felt like it might burst from her chest. And then Theo stepped forward, his voice cutting through the stifling air like a blade. "Do you want the truth, Dad?" he said, his tone steady but firm. "I think it's time you started paying attention to what's been happening in this family. You've been blind for too long." "Theo." Eleanor's voice rang out, sharp and desperate, but it was already too late. Nathan's expression darkened, his gaze locking onto his son like a hawk honing in on its prey. "What are you talking about?" Time seemed to stop. The room fell into an oppressive silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock, each second dragging them closer to the inevitable. Eleanor felt everything spiraling out of her control, slipping further and further away with each passing moment. The secret had been dragged to the edge of the cliff, and now it only needed one final push to plummet into the abyss. Nathan stared at Theo, his gaze as cold as an iceberg yet burning with a quiet fury. Eleanor stood frozen between the two men, the weight of her guilt tightening around her like a noose. She had no idea how to stop what was about to unfold, but she knew with crushing certainty that the worst was just moments away. "What are you talking about, Theo?" Nathan's voice cut through the silence, deep and steady, but his eyes bored into his son with an intensity that demanded answers. Theo stood his ground unflinching. He met his father's gaze head-on, with neither hesitation nor fear. "I'm talking about the things you don't see, the things you've chosen not to see. You don't know who your wife really is, and you have no idea what you've left behind every time you walk out that door for work." Eleanor felt the air leave her lungs. She tried to step forward, to stop him, to plead with him, but her body refused to move. She could only watch as Sarah, standing to the side, avoided everyone's gaze. Her nervous fidgeting betrayed her discomfort, but she didn't speak. Nathan's brow furrowed as he turned to Eleanor, his tone sharp and accusing. "Eleanor, what is he talking about? What does this mean?" "Nathan," Eleanor began, her voice barely audible, trembling under the weight of the moment. "Don't force her to say it," Theo interjected, his voice calm but firm, his eyes still locked on his father. "I'll tell you. The truth is, there's something between her and me that you never noticed because you were never here to see it." Nathan's face darkened further as he swung back toward Eleanor, his voice now trembling with a mix of rage and disbelief. "Eleanor, is this true? Is he telling the truth?" It felt as though Eleanor's world was crumbling around her. Her throat tightened, trapping any attempt at words. The silence stretched painfully, suffocating everyone in the room. And in that silence, her inability to deny the accusation spoke louder than any confession ever could. "You think this is okay, Theo?" Nathan suddenly shouted, his voice booming through the room. "You think you can destroy this family because of your selfish feelings?" Theo remained unshaken, but a flicker of pain crossed his face, a brief, raw vulnerability. "This family," he retorted with a bitter laugh. "You've never had a family, Dad. You were always too busy with your work to see anything that mattered, and now you want to blame me?" Nathan's glare hardened, his anger burning into Theo, but instead of responding, he turned his focus back to Eleanor. "And you? Do you have nothing to say for yourself?" Eleanor couldn't withstand the weight of his gaze. It wasn't just the look of a betrayed man, it was the look of someone who had lost everything. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a precipice, where any step she took would only drag all of them deeper into the abyss. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered, her voice breaking into a sob. "I didn't mean for this to happen, I didn't think it would go this far, but I can't deny that something happened between Theo and me." The room fell into a deathly silence. Nathan stood motionless, as though every ounce of strength had been drained from his body. Theo said nothing, but after a long pause he turned and walked out of the room without looking back. The heavy slam of the door echoed through the house, leaving an unbearable emptiness behind. Nathan looked at Eleanor one last time, his voice hoarse and heavy with sorrow. "I trusted you," he said, each word cutting like a knife. "But now, I don't know what to believe anymore." Eleanor couldn't decide what hurt more, Nathan's devastated expression or the hollow ache left by Theo's absence. She stood alone in the middle of the room, feeling as though her entire world had collapsed beneath her feet. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter than it had ever been. Nathan didn't come home. Theo vanished without a trace, leaving no sign of where he had gone. Eleanor was left to face the silence and her own regrets, endlessly wondering if anything could ever be salvaged. One evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Eleanor sat on the porch, her eyes fixed on the empty road in the distance. She didn't know what she was waiting for. A word of forgiveness from Nathan, a sign of life from Theo, or perhaps just a fleeting moment of peace for her weary soul. Finally, she stood, walked back into the house, and closed the door behind her. The world outside continued on, indifferent to her pain. But inside her heart, a crossroads had appeared, and she had no idea which path to take. Her story, Nathan's story, Theo's story, they all ended in uncertainty, leaving a secret that only time could unravel.